Hello, welcome to your week 3 lesson 1 video where we're going to look at some advanced file management commands and concepts. Uh, so in this first video we're going to look at the differences between your different types of file names, of path names, file path names, either terminology works, right? So we have absolute, relative, and relative to home path names, and I'm going to give you a demonstration of those. Now, everything in this maps directly to your tutorial number 3, investigation 1, which is due next Friday at 11:59, or not 11:59 p.m. Sorry, at midnight. Wrong course. So we talked a little bit about file names last week, right? Or file names, path names. So a path name is a fully specified location to a unique file system, or a unique file name within the file system. The concept of path names relates to every operating system, whether it's Unix, Linux, Windows, DOS, Mac, doesn't matter. It's also very useful when you get into web design, dealing with path names for accessing files on the server and linking and stuff like that, which you're going to look at if you're a programming stream student in your second semester. You're going to learn some web design. I think it's your second semester. Anyway, so last week we used a path name from our home directory to create and manipulate a couple directories and text files. There's different types of path names that we can use to access a directory or file. And we've got an example here, right? So we have the same file. We've got it /home/userid /uli101/cars.txt. That would be an example of an absolute path name. Samples/cars.txt, that would be a sample or an example of a relative path name. And tilde/cars.txt would be an example of a relative to home path name. Now, these different types of path names, knowing when to pick the correct one to use will make your workflow a bit more efficient, or can. Sometimes you want a relative or a relative to home. Sometimes you want an absolute. It depends on what you're working with, right? So first up, and we're going to look at all of these individually, naturally. First up, we have absolute path names. So absolute path names provide the path to a file or directory, and it always begins with a slash, which represents root, as we learned last week. This type of path is referred to as an absolute path, or an absolute path name, because it begins absolutely from the root directory. So this is good for making sure that you've absolutely got the correct file regardless of where you are in the file system, right? Because it defines the file or directory's location from root absolutely. So this type of path name requires that you always provide the full path name starting with root. And if you're ever not sure what type of path name an absolute path is, always remember, if it's absolute, it begins with root. Right? So absolute path names can be useful if you don't know what your current directory is within the system. They can definitely help you understand the full layout of the path name and the directory structure. They're also really helpful with if you're doing any sort of automation with scripting, which we're going to look at in a few weeks, and you want your script to write data to a file, or maybe it's extracting data from a location in the system, right? Well, you don't know where your script is necessarily going to exist in the file system. It might be moved around it later, so you may want to use an absolute path name for those types of of purposes. Make sense? Normally I would be looking in chat to see if anybody agrees or not, and yeah, hopefully it makes sense. So some examples of absolute path names, we have /bin, right? It begins with a slash, it begins with root, so it is an absolute path name. And home, /home, I should say, user ID, ULI 101 examples. Again, it begins with a slash, it begins from root, so it is an absolute directory, or absolute path name. Hopefully that makes sense. We're going to move on to relative path names. So relative path names are paths, or is a path to a file or directory that begins from your current directory. So it's called a relative path name because it's relative to where you are within the file system. So a note about these, right? In order to use a relative path name, you have to know where you are in the file system. You have to know the location of your current directory. And what command might we use for that? I'm going to give you kind of a pause for a second. You might want to pause if you're watching so you can see if you get the answer right. pwd, right? If you don't know where you are, the pwd, print working directory command, will show you where you are. So you have to know where you are in the file system to use an absolute or a relative path name. Now there's two relative path name symbols, and we sort of touched on these last week, but we're going to learn a bit more about them right now. Remember when we issued ls-a in our current directory, or ls-la, either way, and we saw dot and dot dot, and those exist in absolutely every directory on the file system. Dot, or period, a single period, represents your current directory. Two dots, or two periods, represents the parent directory, so one level up. Using a relative path name can result in a shorter path name, which is an advantage, but it can be a bit more confusing depending on where in the file system the thing that you're trying to access, copy, move, whatever you're trying to do with it, exists in relation to where you currently are. That make sense? So some examples here, dot dot slash dot dot slash dot dot slash bin. So I think that's assuming we're in the examples directory. One level up, one level up, one level up. No, it can't be the examples directory. It would have to be the ULI 101 directory. So one level up, one level up, one level up again. We're in root, bin. Does that make sense? Also, if we're just in the ULI 101 directory, the name of the directory, right? Examples. That's relative. It's relative to where we are. So that's where it would be really handy, is if you're in that directory and you know it's a subdirectory or a file that exists within that directory. And you could also use ./examples, and we tend to not really use this outside of executing bash scripts, as you're going to learn in later in the semester, right? We're going to talk about bash scripting. I was going to say which week, but I don't remember which week offhand, but we are going to touch on that later in the semester. And then finally we have relative to home path names. So these always begin with the tilde, which represents the user's home directory, the current user's home directory. And tilde always expands to your home directory. So tilde will expand to /home / your user ID. Advantages to these, again, could be result in less typing. It could be a shorter path name used to access the thing you're trying to access. And a nice handy thing about these, and you've used these with the tutorial check scripts, is you can provide the name of a user on the system after the tilde, and that will change it from relative to your home directory to relative to that user's home directory. So you've been issuing tilde ULI 101 / week 1 check, right? Or week 2 check, or whatever the check script is. These are files that exist in the ULI 101 user's home directory. That makes perfect sense. So examples of these, we have tilde slash ULI101 slash examples. So this is relative to your home directory, right? Because we have a slash after the tilde. And tilde ULI101 slash notes. Tilde Murray Saul. So we know right off the bat this is relative to Murray Saul's home directory slash ULI101 slash notes. So it can be a handy way of accessing things. Let's take a peek at some examples of using those. I think this is going to be a relatively short demo video. We'll see. So I'm already SSH'd into Matrix. I've already got my connection all set up and I'm ready to go. And I'm in my my home directory. And I've also got an ls of the ULI101 slash demo, or ULI101 demo directory, which is demo within the ULI101 subdirectory that exists within my home directory. So I've got a directory listing of all of those things up, because that may or may not be a useful thing, right? I'm going to actually change into that directory for this first part, but I'm going to keep those files around. So I'm going to change to ULI101 demo, right? Because this would be a relative path. It's relative to where I am. I've changed directories. We can see demo is there. And I'm going to create some directories. Pretty much the same directories we created last week. I'm going to create tutorials, examples, and sample. So mkdir, but I'm going to use different path names. First, I'm going to use a relative to my home directory. So tilde ULI101 slash demo tutorials to make the tutorials directory. Next, I'm going to use an absolute. I'll do an ls to confirm. We see tutorials was created. Now I'm going to issue an absolute path name for examples. So mkdir, whoops, home, my username, whoops, helps if I spell my name right, ULI101 demo, examples, and I'm going to finally use just a relative, right? I'm going to create notes as well. If I do an ls to confirm, I have examples, notes, and tutorials. I'm going to create a sample directory as well. Do an ls to confirm. So there's another, we know it's relative to home, right? Because it begins with a tilde. I'm going to remove that. It's an empty directory, so I can use the rmdir command with the rmdir with a relative path name. Finally, I'm going to, well, not finally, there might be a bit more here. I'm going to create some empty files in there. So in tutorials, and I'm going to use relative path names for these. So tutorial 1 in tutorials, note 1 in notes, and example 1 in examples. And if I do a tree, we can see that took, along with the stuff that I had last week. Now you can mix and match these too from the command line. So if I were to move the contents of the tutorial directory, I'm actually going to move tutorial 1. So demo, whoops, tutorials, tutorial 1, and I'm going to move that to notes. So you see I'm mixing a relative to home and a relative path name here. And we'll do a tree to confirm. It worked. So, like my point here is, once you start using one, you're not stuck with it. You can switch it up. You can use one, you can use the other, you can mix and match. You're going to use whatever one makes the most sense in context, right? And by context, I mean like what you're doing in the context of what you're doing and what you're trying to resolve here. I'm going to remove all of those. Whoops. And do an ls to confirm. So yeah, it's just all cleaned up. Let's go back to our slides. So all of this is a quick video, right? All of this maps to tutorial 3, advanced file management and quoting special characters, investigation 1, which is all about path names, absolute, relative, and relative to home path names. So quick review. If it begins with root, right? If it begins with a slash, it's an absolute. If it begins with a tilde, it's relative to home, and anything else is going to be relative. Hopefully that makes sense. Have at those. Well, we're going to have those in our lab period this week, right? Thank you for watching. Take care. Be safe. Have a great week. See you in the next video.